Hello, and welcome to Achieving the Vision. I'm Melissa Silva, your host for this series. Today's episode is titled Accelerating Change Through Aligned Action, and we're thrilled to highlight the national movement led by StriveTogether, an organization committed to ensuring every child has every opportunity to succeed from cradle to career. Joining us is Jennifer Blatz, President and CEO of StriveTogether. Jennifer is a nationally recognized leader in building place-based partnerships to improve outcomes for children. She played a key role in launching StriveTogether's Cradle to Career Network and developing their bold goal of putting 4 million more young people on a path to economic mobility by 2030. Under her leadership, StriveTogether has been recognized globally for its systems transformation work. Today's episode is especially exciting because it will be facilitated by Dr. Ashish Vaidya, President and CEO of Growing Inland Achievement. Dr. Vaidya brings decades of leadership experience in higher education, including roles as President of Northern Kentucky University and senior leadership at multiple California State University campuses. I will now hand it over to Dr. Vaidya to lead this conversation.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. I'm delighted to be here and really excited about this opportunity to have a conversation with Jennifer. Our paths, of course, crossed together back in Northern Kentucky when I was there as president. And of course, Jennifer was doing trailblazing work with the Strive Together work. And so I'm excited that our sort of full circle has come and we're able to engage in this conversation. So Jennifer, welcome to this podcast and to GIA.
Great to be here with you.
All right, so I do have some questions. I want to make sure that our listeners get a chance to get to know a little bit more about the work that you're doing. So maybe for those that are unfamiliar, Jennifer, just maybe briefly share the mission of StriveTogether, your theory of action. Alyssa mentioned your bold vision right now. So maybe just give us the sort of high level, what's this organization all about and why is it so important?
Yeah, so I'm happy to be able to share more about StriveTogether, and thank you for having me. So StriveTogether is a national movement with a very clear purpose. Our mission is to support communities so that they can support young people in their communities to thrive and reach their full potential. And Ashish, as you mentioned, we had a chance to, our paths crossed when you were at the University of, at Northern Kentucky University in Northern Kentucky. We got our start here at StriveTogether doing this work locally in Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky now more than 15 years ago. We figured some things out about what it looks like to align different sectors, different partners in a community around a shared vision for putting more young people on a path to economic mobility. But it was really when we started to connect with other communities across the country who were, also trying to do the same work to really align around a vision for young people and supporting young people on their path toward mobility, that we really began to learn and convene this national movement called StriveTogether. And since we launched the national network in 2011, we launched our theory of action in 2013. So our theory of action is really a roadmap, a set of kind of key milestones for what it looks like to get a partnership in a community started and to ultimately build what we call cradle to career civic infrastructure. And cradle to career civic infrastructure. So you have like physical infrastructure in communities, bridges, roads, things that get you here to there. We all know the physical infrastructure. But civic infrastructure is what it looks like when you're really connecting all of the different sectors, factors, organizations, systems, and structures that play into whether or not a young person can thrive starting at birth all the way through post-secondary and into career. And so that's really what the work is about. That's what the theory of action is. We launched our first version of this theory of action back in 2013, as I mentioned. And we have iterated on that theory of action 6 times. So we're at our 6th version of this sort of framework or roadmap for what it looks like to build cradle to career civic infrastructure. And that's all based on the learning from the 70 communities that we support across our national network. We learn from them every single day, and that really informs the work we do at StriveTogether.
That's wonderful, Jennifer. And I will be picking up a couple of those themes around civic infrastructure in a few minutes. Alyssa, it looks like we have our second guest joining us. I don't know if you want to quickly intervene to introduce him, and then we can continue with the podcast.
Yes, absolutely. We are now joined by Josh Davis, Vice President of Policy and Partnerships at StriveTogether. Josh leads the organization's strategy for policy, advocacy, and mobilization, while building national partnerships that support progress across their network. With a strong background in collective impact, government relations, and result-based accountability, Josh brings deep expertise in aligning cross-sector efforts to create meaningful change for youth and families. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Josh, you came right at the right moment. Jennifer just gave us a great overview of the mission, the vision, the theory of action behind StriveTogether. But I wanted to kind of get a sense from you about the policy advocacy work that you are engaged in and that you lead for Strive. Why is policy advocacy an essential element in strengthening cradle to career outcomes? And then I'd love to hear a little bit about what have you seen around the national landscape in effective strategies that have transformed things at the local or regional level.
Yeah. Ashish, there's no way to separate systems transformation from policy. Systems transformation is policy. Systems are employed by people, but systems are rules, procedures, protocols. And that is the realm of policy. So as people inside of organizations are running programs, are running coordinating bodies of work to strengthen and compound efforts, those practices can either be accelerated towards improving outcomes, or those practices can be mitigated or even changed so that they do not arrive at the same degree of effectiveness, depending on the actual policy environment, the regulatory environment. And so policy is essentially systems change. So the work that we take up throughout the country in the StriveTogether network is this both and. It is the things that you do in terms of service delivery, this coordination, being able to identify the populations that are in most need of being surrounded by systems that put them on a pathway to economic mobility. And it is working around and within that policy environment itself, so that it is creating this fertile soil so that when you're planting these new strategies and planning new tactics and activities and compounding these sets of compounding efforts together, that they actually have fertile soil to produce the most desirable fruit. And so what we have seen across the country that exemplifies the ability to create these conditions, if I start at the state level, because legislative bodies at the state level are small enough that you can have really distinct parts of a state represented with seemingly the same power, the same voice. If we take the nation state of California, Northern California is incredibly different from the Imperial region. It is incredibly different from the San Joaquin Valley and the Chula Vista region. And so because there is such a diversity of representation in the state legislative body, we've seen that when you're able to help regions of a state, urban, rural, suburban, those sovereign nations that are all sharing the same land, when you're able to help create the environment for them to determine what they have in common and how they can be better together than they can apart. We've seen these examples where state policy actually creates a much more sound and supportive ecosystem and environment so that in the locales where community practitioners and place-based partnerships are seeking to improve outcomes, they have this cascading effect to work within from state policy.
I love that analogy about policy advocacy as systems change, right? That is really a very important takeaway to think about this. And your last point about alignment between what state policy can do and how it translates at the local level makes a great deal of sense. So Jennifer, earlier we heard about Strive Together's bold vision, right? 4 million more young people on the path to economic mobility by 2030, no less. It's inspiring, it's bold. Uh, what progress have you seen so far? How do you measure success at this stage?
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, our goal of putting more young people on a path to economic mobility, this 4 million futures, as we've been talking about it, this is something new for Strive Together. Over the last 10, to 15 years that we've been really doing this national network work, we've measured progress, really been focusing on moving partnerships, the cradle to career partnerships I described, are across our theory of action and accelerating their progress. But that doesn't matter unless we are truly transforming systems and achieving population level change for young people across those cradle to career outcomes. So this 4 million more young people on a path goal that we have put forth together with our national network of communities is intended to galvanize the network of partnerships. And you asked about progress. I would say, first and foremost, we are early in the work. This is a 7-year plan. We're in year 2 of this plan to get more than 4 million more young people on a path to mobility by the year 2030. And right now we're in the phase of really working with our network of communities to name their number. So looking at the population that our network of partnerships, and these are rural and urban partnerships across the country, who have, mostly at the county level, but some are at the multi-county level, some are regional, some are very city-based, to kind of look at the population of young people that they have the potential to impact in those communities, and then name a number of and really the way we're measuring this. And again, with Strive Together, we're talking about, and Josh did a great job of talking about the systems change and systems transformation nature of this work, which is not direct service. So when you're talking about moving young people across the path to mobility and really getting them to achieve improvement and these key milestones, each of our partnerships measure those outcomes, starting at kindergarten readiness, reading at grade level, middle grade math achievement, high school graduation, post-secondary enrollment, post-secondary completion, and employment. They're measuring that at the population level, and what we're looking for are improvements in those milestones. Because to measure economic mobility, we're going to have to wait, years to look at, were young people better off? But right now we're looking at, are young people on a path to mobility? And we see those outcomes that I named as a proxy for mobility. And so it's bold. I would say that we are the only national intermediary doing place-based partnership work in this way, who are holding this level of accountability for moving those population level outcomes in that way. We talk about not letting perfect be the enemy of good, because it is really hard when you're not doing the direct service work, when you're really doing the systems change work, as Josh described, to measure progress and measure outcomes. But we've seen this happen in communities. We've seen where we've been able to see population level improvements and reduction and elimination of disparities around core outcomes like literacy, early literacy, grade, 8th grade math, algebra by the 8th grade. We've been able to see these policy changes lead to improvements in outcomes and reduction of disparities. So we want to actually see that at a greater scale. So that's what this bold goal is about.
Jennifer, I really love the idea of bold and inspiring vision, but I equally resonate with the fact that you have to have a number, right? I think nothing spurs action more than a number. Otherwise, it's just, lofty ideals and goals. And it's a national call when you say, what's your number, right? And it goes back to that. So I really like that. It certainly resonates with us here at GIA and in the Inland Empire. So we're excited about this approach. We're taking a very similar approach in our strategic plan to think about what are we going to do in terms of transformation. It might seem a little bit too bold, but you need that North Star. So I think that's great. Hey, Josh. So Jennifer talked earlier about something. She put it very eloquently about civic infrastructure. What this is a national movement about civic infrastructure, and I'm curious about your perspective on this notion. First, what is it? What does civic infrastructure means? I'm just curious about what our listeners might know, and how does it translate into actual results for the work that we're trying to do?
Yeah. So, Ashish, in 2020, our national office began to try to explain in simple terms how we understand civic infrastructure. Civic infrastructure has always been a terminology that lived within our theory of action. So, going back to the early days of our first theory of action being developed by our network in our national office, we described it as a blueprint for building this civic infrastructure. So funny story, in 2020, I met Jeff Moore, who's with Independent Sector. And this is during the time when the Biden administration, as they had come into the office, was talking about human infrastructure, specifically in the wake of the pandemic, and specifically thinking about the need for our country to get back to work, balanced with the need for there to be safe childcare, and those two having to work hand in hand. And so the Biden administration and Congress was using this terminology of human infrastructure, meaning the human economy that is necessary for products, widgets, and services to be able to still be produced. Along that same time, Independent Sector was using this terminology, civic infrastructure. And I saw it and I called Jeff. I said, hey, never heard of you guys. I see you're using civic infrastructure. What do you mean by this? And in so many ways, they were holding the electoral process, civic engagement, the way that people are engaged in democracy. And in addition to this economy that is necessary to have childcare as a central component of our economy to still move forward, widgets, products, services. And so I explained to Jeff and the friends at Independent Sector the way that we think about civic infrastructure in lots of ways is borrowed from the analogy of economic development. And so if there is an industrial area that sits outside of Bakersfield or sits right on the edge of Sonoma, and there is a commercial interest, there's an ability for the economy to grow in that region, and you want to build out this industrial parkway or this industrial part of the community, the land has to be cleared. Wiring, water, sewer, electricity, fiber for Wi-Fi, all of that sort of piping, those things that you don't see, they don't sort of emanate anything that's really visible until you need them. All of that has to be done. And then you see where the market allows for a commercial, residential, investors, public, private to come in and build up what's tangible and what people have the most proximity to. You need to buy food, you need a place to live. And those are the things that you see right off the bat. But there's this entire process that took place to establish the ability for commercial residential needs to be met. And then there's this ongoing maintenance as natural disasters come and your infrastructure needs to be repaired because of natural disaster or wear and tear. So from that analogy, we describe civic infrastructure as this same connectivity. It's like the muscles and the tissues that hold a community together. And when it's time to activate those muscles, you understand and see how this civic infrastructure has the ability to solve for more than what it was initially stood up for. So while a community might initially start to pull together data sharing agreements between a K-12 system, a higher education institution, and a local workforce entity, in times of other needs, you can understand how that infrastructure is not only solving for the creation of a talent pipeline, but it's able to help identify what's necessary lower on Maslow's hierarchy of needs in order for people's basic needs to be met. So students that are unhoused, for families that are struggling with health impairments that impede learning for a child that's in the fifth grade. You can see how this infrastructure between data and relationships of people in these organizations are now turning and pivoting that infrastructure to solve for something else that ladders up to an outcome that they were initially stood up for. And so we tend to think that if you borrow from the economic development sort of lens of what's necessary for infrastructure to be laid out and tended to before you can get to a more tangible commercial residential need that everybody identifies with and says, oh, that's worthy. The same thing with communities. That civic infrastructure allows for a multitude of different needs within a community to be met, even though it may have been brought forth because of a desire to improve the talent pipeline, the workforce pipeline, housing conditions in a community. And so that's how we've attempted to describe it over the last 5 years. And I would say that there is a movement evidenced by the fact that the past administration, the past Congress was using this human infrastructure terminology that is synonymous with the way that we were understanding how people need to be connected within organizations and systems so that there's the ability to identify where there's a convergence of outcomes, issues, of goals, and what each organization and systems brings to bear towards achieving these goals over the long haul for an entire population.
Absolutely. And I think this idea that for a thriving economy, you can't just have great physical infrastructure or even human infrastructure. You need that civic infrastructure that can elevate all the aspects. And as you put it so eloquently, Josh, the connectivity that actually serves more than what its original purpose was. And I think now more than ever, we need to be thinking about the civic infrastructure needs of our communities. And are we investing in that just as we think about investing in human infrastructure and physical infrastructure? What do we need to do? We could have a whole other conversation about, sort of that aspect. But I really think the way you brought it down to making the alignment with the other aspects of infrastructure that we're familiar with makes a great deal of sense.
And Ashish, I
So
think there's two things that are important that make this challenging. One is this infrastructure is invisible. So if we go back to um, the example of economic development, a, a company that is providing, um, telehealth services for a region, um, the recipients who are receiving these services, they're not thinking about the fiber optic cables until those cables go out and they can't actually receive the services they need. Um, and so the invisibility aspect of this infrastructure is one of the challenges that as a field uh, and as a movement, we have to continue to do everything that we can so that more and more decision makers and more people that are in communities understand the importance of this invisibility factor. And the other challenge is connecting this infrastructure to the actual change that takes place. So someone that might be receiving therapy over the course of a year, made possible by this infrastructure that allows for a company to then be able to provide this in a telehealth capacity, in a telehealth way. If they arrive at better health in a year, eventually, and their work performance improves and their parenting improves and their children are doing better, it's not that that infrastructure didn't play a role. It's the correlation and the ability to connect it in a convincing way that is one of those other challenges that as a field, it presents it as an opportunity and a challenge for all of us to be able to speak to this correlation, this connectivity, why it's vital, even though it's invisible and it is somewhat distant from the human interaction and touch point at the delivery of a service.
We economists would call that sort of a social or a public good. By investing in that, it leads to positive externalities for the things much more beyond the immediate thing. So you're so right about saying why an investment in this is so critical for economies to succeed. So Jennifer, earlier we spoke about the national movement that Strive Together represents, and I think it speaks to certainly for so many of us at GIA in this community, this idea that every child deserves an opportunity to succeed, regardless of their zip code, their race, their ethnicity. That's when people ask me, well, why did you come to the U.S. to study? And I used to say, I think it's those two fundamental tenets. The United States is the land of opportunity, and it's the land of intergenerational mobility. The idea that and of course, higher education is the pathway to that. I still believe in that absolutely. My question to you is, this American dream is in serious jeopardy right now. What will it take to reverse this troubling trend? And why is this even more relevant in today's climate?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. I mean, I think a couple of things that it's going to take to reverse this trend. First of all, we need to broaden the understanding of this trend. It's amazing we're in this work, all of us, we're in this work every single day. We see the data. We look at, the work that Raj Chetty has done to look at economic mobility and to see that the country has been in decline in terms of economic mobility since the 1940s. Obviously, I would say even our current political climate demonstrates that there's an awareness to this, like that it's really hard for kids to, growing up, what does every parent want for their child? For them to be better off, for them to have a better life. This is what my parents wanted, what every parent wants, and this is what I want for my children. And I don't know if there's this clear, if there's still a disconnect of that. The reality is that our systems and structures that have been created and evolved, and then we've just been through a global pandemic, and now there's an attack on public education, and sort of what's happening is that this dream is getting farther away. Now, I know that sounds, I feel like I want to retract. It's not that I have hope I absolutely have hope that we will be able to reverse this trend because of the good work that's happening in communities across the country, that we see the work through the Strive Together network and some of our other national organizations that we partner with. They're doing local work in place to improve mobility outcomes, but we have to tell the story better. We have to tell the story about the fact that an additional 4 million young people on a path to economic mobility is projected to contribute $3.2 trillion in GDP. And so when there is that return on investment, when we invest in the future of our young people and through cradle to career, we see that those economic impacts, and we don't tell this story as effectively as we could be and we should be. I think we do in some places, but what gives me hope is that I do see opportunities to reverse this trend, particularly in states where we have many place-based partnerships, not only part of the Strive Together network, but we have a number of national organizations we're partnering with, like Partners for Rural Impact, who is supporting rural place-based partnerships throughout the country. The William Julius Wilson Institute at the Harlem Children's Zone, who focuses on deep neighborhood work in places across the country, and Purpose-Built Communities, which is another national organization that has focused on strengthening the built environment to support putting more young people on a path to economic mobility in communities across the country. These different national movements that Strive Together is fortunate to be partnering with, we're seeing pockets of excellence across the country, places where this work is happening. What we need to be doing is spreading this work faster, accelerating the progress of places, getting, as Josh mentioned, focusing on policy to ensure that we have strong policy environments, particularly at the state and locally, but ultimately at the federal government. We know right now that's not the current context. That's not our current reality. It is not a supportive policy environment currently for this type of work, but it could be and it should be. And I think, if anything, this last election told us that the economy and the opportunity in the United States is something that's top of mind for Americans. And this is a strategy that we see in communities that can really ensure that young people do have every opportunity, ensure that those who are coming to the United States for that opportunity have that opportunity. We have to keep that front and center. Sharing the data, we're a data-driven organization, getting the data out there, showing the disparities, telling the story effectively, and then telling the story of what this could look like, what it does look like in places, and what it could look like if we get to the scale we're working towards getting to.
Yeah, this is, by the way, great segue into my next question. But I think this idea of investing in the American dream provides great return on investment. Regardless of your socioeconomic status, regardless of where you are, I think can make for a very compelling argument and a narrative, because I think that appeals to everybody. You don't have to have a partisan point of view to say, look, why is this a good investment? Because you get so much in return for it. So, Josh, the question of data comes to mind. How does data play an important role in moving communities from talk to action? And can you maybe share an example of where you've seen this either highlight or elevate a critical barrier, or even an opportunity for success with youth and families?
I think there are lots of examples. I want to step back and philosophically sort of name something. So I'm from the American South, and the history of the American South being so binary and rife with black and white juxtaposition makes it even today sometimes stressful. Sometimes there's tension when communities are talking about and wanting to improve outcomes in their communities. And because everybody knows the history, there's this immediacy to overplay and throw attention into race being the factor that sort of separates. And it's really hard to focus on strategies and solutions when we think about, the 1600s to 2025. It's overwhelming. Most people would agree that if you have trusted data that describes a population's well-being, and you can disaggregate that data by gender, by zip code, by racial or ethnic identity, that you have the ability to maybe consider what's a baseline of truth. And so when you can find trusted data that represents a population, and in our world, it's cradle to career, it's all children in Indianola, Mississippi, arriving at kindergarten is ready. It's all children in Indianola, Mississippi, that are graduating from high school. And when you can disaggregate that from a trusted source, it allows for people who are doing this work to oftentimes decouple and depersonalize what their contribution or lack of contribution is to have an initial conversation. So in my professional experience and as a practitioner, data is invaluable for that reason. It's one thing to hold an anecdotal story, example, or account for why Black children in Sunflower County are arriving at kindergarten at an undesirable rate, and particularly compared to non-Black children. It's another way of approaching this when you devise a data log that puts out numbers, that puts out communities, blocks, that disaggregates by race, disaggregates by gender, and allow people first and foremost to determine, is this a trusted source of data? That's really, really important for people, for a school district to say, I don't know where you got this data. This is not our data. And so I don't know if I can even engage in a solution-oriented process until we get to that place. And so getting to a trusted and verifiable data set is really important. So by engaging in a data walk or a conversation around data that allow individuals to process and determine, do I trust this data? And then secondly, what's my appetite to do anything differently? Like that's the big question. Again, because people make up systems and organizations. And unless people are personally or professionally held accountable to act differently, you can recognize that data is trusted, but maybe you don't have the will, the appetite as a person or in your professional role to do anything different. It just is what it is. I don't know what I could be doing in my role or my organization as a food bank to improve third grade reading. Like we're so separate, but there's a whole methodology and a whole way that we at StriveTogether help to put a result in the center and help each sector around that result determine what is their contribution to improving this result. And how do you measure that? What's the target that you all want to set for your whole population for 3 years out for third grade reading? And to help a food bank understand the population that they serve and what they might be doing in a more collaborative fashion to ensure that rising third graders and third graders are getting the type of nutrition and their families are getting that type of nutrition and what they need, and that's their contribution. And so philosophically, I from my own experience, I think those are the things that make data important. Is it trusted? And when you observe it as an individual, what is your appetite to do something different? Is that going to activate you to at least be open to the need to address something that most people would find undesirable?
Yeah, that's really well put. I think it's also a case that I've seen where when you translate that data to the local and regional level, it has more impact because there is some skepticism, maybe even cynicism about national data and national trends. People automatically say, well, that doesn't apply to me. But when you bring it down to saying, here's what's happening in San Bernardino, here's what's happening in Riverside, that changes the conversation completely because now everyone sits up in those communities and says, wait a second, we're
These are
not
our
talking
kids.
about, yeah, we're talking about what's happening in our backyard now.
Yeah.
And if good or bad, right? That's supposed to. So I think you're right about the trusted nature of the data and to be able to translate that from a global, national level to local and regional level. Jennifer, I'd like you to close it out a little bit, if you don't mind, in the last couple of minutes that we have. As you look to the future, what message do you want to leave for educators, for community leaders, for partners, as we all strive together to create equitable systems for our youth and families?
The message that I want to leave is that this is the work. This is a necessity. We have to figure out how to get aligned around a collective vision for our young people. I feel like every day we look at the data. We were just talking about the data, and we look at the recent NAEP scores. We see the data. It's not where we want it to be. We have not recovered from the global pandemic. Things were not great before that. We've had these systemic challenges. So if not now, like when are we going to address these systemic barriers that are keeping every young person from being able to have that opportunity to achieve the American dream? If that is really what we hold in this country as a truth, and no matter how we define that, and this defined in different ways, it doesn't, we recognize, although we are holding accountability for these 7 cradle to career outcomes, there are many different pathways to ensuring that every young person has an opportunity to thrive. But we have to come together and define those pathways. And something we've been talking about as part of this current 2030 strategy is this idea. Now I'm going to get really wonky. I hate to bring it back to civic infrastructure, but this idea, we call it nested civic infrastructure. So this idea of at the deepest neighborhood levels, we have to be working to get those who are most impacted by systems at the very much, we're talking about residents, young people, community members at the deep neighborhood level, invested in and democratize data so that they can understand these are our kids, and here's what we want to see for our kids, and be able to raise that work up. So it's the idea of neighborhood to national is what we talk about. So if you're doing that work at the deep neighborhood level and democratizing the data through that civic infrastructure, what does it look like then at the regional level to really transform systems, to look at not only our education systems, but health and human services, justice, transportation, housing. We have a housing crisis in this country. Like, all of these different systems need to be able to be addressed and aligned around those young people, and then translate that into state policy, as we've talked about, and ultimately federal policy, and this vision for the America that we say we want to be. And we hear that, we see that reflected through civic engagement. So really, what's it going to take? And we believe that's possible. That's our vision. We hold this vision. We're holding those 4 million young people on a path to economic mobility. We'll hold accountability. We'll encourage communities to name their number, and we'll be transparent about our progress. We're already, I didn't mention this earlier, but we do have 2/3 of the network have named their number, and that accounts for about 1.3 million young people. And so we need to raise that number. So we need to work with more communities and capture the state impact, and really work towards those numbers and towards those goals. So that's our vision at StriveTogether. We know it's achievable when we work together, and we really are looking ahead at what's possible. And this is certainly the moment for us to lead.
Very good. Well, and I know we're looking forward to being part of that network as well, and we'll certainly add to that number. So I'm excited about that. But I think nothing compels action than hope and inspiration, rather than despondency. So I think you're right on. It resonates so much with our communities and our regions. Thank you so much to both of you for being such great participants in this conversation. Alyssa, I'll turn it back to you to close it out.
Thank you again to Jennifer Blatz and Josh Davis for sharing your insights and the work being done through StriveTogether to transform systems and create real, measurable change for young people and families across the country. Today's conversation reminded us that achieving economic mobility at scale isn't just about programs, like Jennifer mentioned. It's about aligning action, building civic infrastructure, and using data with purpose, and centering equity in everything that we do. If you're an educator, policymaker, or community leader, we hope this episode inspires you to think bigger, act bolder, and partner more deeply to ensure every child has an opportunity to succeed no matter their background. Thanks for tuning in to Achieving the Vision. I'm Melissa Silva, and we'll see you next time.